Okay, I'm gonna let people in.
Awesome.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're really excited to have all of you. And if you could just quickly just type yes into the chat, I just want to make sure everyone hears us and there's no issue with sound. We're really happy that you're here. We're going to jump right in just so that we make the most of our hour, and I'll let people in as needed. Okay, so let's go right away, Sam, and let's get started. And I'm looking forward. Okay, Sam, thank you so much for hosting this. Can you just tell us a little
Sure,
bit about
no problem.
yourself? Go right ahead.
Sure. So my name is Sam. As Francis mentioned, I recently finished my master's in biological sciences from St. John's. I took my MCAT last January. I got a 515, and that was with about a month and a half of crunch time studying, whereas most people take 5 to 6 months. I'm applying to medical school this cycle. I have 3 interviews so far at schools that are kind of like top programs. So I'm very excited about that as well. So I've been tutoring MCAT for the past 6 to 7 months now. I've had multiple MCAT students. I understand what's on the exam, but more importantly, I've figured out a way to understand how to study for the exam, which I feel is incredibly undervalued by the AAMC. So the AAMC likes to treat this like a content exam, but it's really a strategy exam. A lot of times the AAMC on a passage will give you difficult material that you've never seen before with the intention of seeing how you respond to something that scares you. And to that extent, I've developed some strategies around those difficult AAMC passages. My biology section was very, very difficult. I scored in the 96th percentile on my biology section because I got such difficult passages that I was able to kind of navigate through and see what the questions were really asking as opposed to the passage itself just trying to scare me. So that's kind of the way that I approach my general MCAT studying. The way that this session is going to run is we're going to overview the exam itself and then the 4 sections that are on the exam, as well as the subjects that it's useful to take before you sit for the exam. First of all, an overview for the exam. So for this previous cycle, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, they made some adjustments to the exam format. It's a 6.5 hour exam now. We expect that during the next cycle, the current plan is to have the exam revert back to the original 8 hour structure. So for this 8 hour structure, it's a 239 question exam broken down into 4 sections, each composed of about 90 to 95 questions. And sorry, each composed of about 50 questions, but you have 90 to 95 minutes to answer each of those 4 sections. So the first section is going to be the chemistry and physics section. So I kind of have an outline here. Sorry, guys.
If you want, you could make the screen smaller. I just want to make sure everyone can see it. It doesn't have to be so large.
Scroll. Okay, awesome. So here's a little bit of an overview of the Chem Phys section of the MCAT. So the MCAT is known for having a little bit of a roll the dice approach when it comes to physics and organic chemistry. These are a little bit random on your MCAT. Sometimes you can get a total of 2 to 3 organic chemistry passages. Sometimes you can get a total of 1 passage. The standard kind of amount of organic chemistry that you can expect to see on your MCAT is that out of the 9 passages that you're going to have for this Chem Phys section, one of them is going to be a difficult organic chemistry passage with easy questions. And those easy questions are all based on content. So Orgo for the exam is what I like to focus on last because the amount of chemistry that you get for that you get tested on the MCAT is really stuff that you cover very heavily in your OChem 1 and OChem 2 classes. So I don't normally focus too much on organic chemistry when I do my MCAT tutoring. Physics, like I said, is the second kind of roll the dice subject on the MCAT. What they love testing about on the MCAT is electrostatics, light and optics, and classical physics, so Newtonian physics in the form of your kinematic formulas. So those 3 main topics are kind of the big 3 of MCAT physics, and everything else just kind of stems from that. You have some low yield questions that we don't really focus about. You know, I always say you can still get the 1 or 2 weird questions that you'll see out of 59 wrong and still get 98th to 99th percentile on that section, as I did for many sections on my own MCAT. So physics, like I said, you have your big three. General chemistry is a little bit more widespread in terms of the topics that the AAMC likes to ask for the MCAT. So the main topic that they stick to for Gen Chem, it's going to be all about atoms and valence shells and orbitals, but they also like to test a lot about cells and galvanic cells and electric potentials at different ends of those galvanic cells. So again, it's the proper interweaving of high yield topics that makes the MCAT so difficult. So just kind of taking a step back, you have three types of MCAT questions. One type of MCAT question is a complete standalone. A standalone question means that it just refers to your knowledge of the material without any interpretation necessary, at least on any difficult passage-based interpretation. A second kind of question is a directly from passage question. So they'll give you some data that the authors of a given passage made, and they'll ask you to interpret it, and they'll see how quick you are to jump to conclusions based on this data that you get from the passage. The third type, which is oftentimes the most difficult, are questions that combine background data with passage data. So you're supposed to intertwine things that you know from your courses and from your MCAT content review with the new information that the passage is presenting you with. So a lot of the Kaplan sets and the printed sets, what they do is that to try to encompass everything that you can possibly see on your exam, information that's given in a passage, they will also enter in their books. And they'll do this under the guise that, oh, you might see this on your exam, so we put it in our book. But that doesn't mean that you're going to be tested on the topic. So
Sam,
outside of,
do me a
yeah,
favor, just because
sure,
a few people just entered the room. So
sure,
just
sure, sure,
really,
sure,
really fast, just go over your background really quickly again, because a
no
few
problem.
people entered.
So for the people that just came in, my name is Sam, as Francis just mentioned. I have a master's degree in biology. I finished undergrad in 2 years, and I finished my master's 3 years out of high school. So this gave me a really good understanding of how to efficiently study for material. And I studied for my MCAT for really a core period of a month and a half. And from this month and a half, I saw a 10-point jump from my original score of about 70th percentile on my practice exams to my upper level scores of about mid 90s percentile. And again, this was over the course of a month and a half. So my research background, so I have 3 years of molecular neuroscience research with high author publications, and a lot of graduate level courses that focus on data interpretation. Also helped me read MCAT level passages, because MCAT level passages are much easier than the dense 20-page papers that I read for my thesis. So I also know how to break down the seemingly difficult AAMC passages to make them really simple to understand when you're in a time crunch like you are in the MCAT. So for those of you that just entered, again, the MCAT is 4 sections. Each section is around 50 questions, and you have 90 to 95 minutes to answer each section. So the old format of the exam was that it was an approximately 8-hour exam, I believe 7.5 hours with the breaks and everything. But during the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the exam was actually shortened to just 6.5 hours. But by our understanding is that for the next cycle and all future cycles after that, they're going to revert back to the old 8-hour format, which is what all the traditional prep companies are preparing their students for. So right now we're just going through kind of a general overview of each of the 4 sections on the MCAT. So I kind of finished the main topics of the chemistry and physics portion of the MCAT. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to the car section. Car section is way later. So this is the 4th section, the psychological, sociological, and biological foundation section. I'm just going to briefly talk about the car section first. So what you guys will see in your studying for the MCAT is that there are many, many different ways to study for the car section, but the popular ones, including the Kaplan method and the Princeton method, are considered extremely erroneous in that they are passage focused and not question focused. Through working with other private MCAT tutors that charge 3 times as much as Francis for this course, I've developed a really interesting car strategy that has not only gotten me 98th percentile on the exam for the car section, but has seen 20-point jumps for numerous other students. So we're going to be going over this strategy during the course. It's a question-centered strategy, meaning that we're not going to be focusing on the passage too much, We're going to be skipping around a lot in the passages, but we're still going to be getting the main ideas that you need for the passage to do really, really well in the car section. So it's kind of a new strategy that we're developing. We're really happy with what we've seen so far by our students that have taken the exam in the past. So we're going to be implementing that strategy throughout this course, definitely. But now focusing, I just shifting gears a little bit to what they call the CARS 2.0 section, which is the Psych Soc section. The Psych Soc section, a lot of people say that it's vocab. I heavily disagree with this. I think that it's not vocab, it's AAMC vocab. And the main difference is that you can have certain terms that have definitions that are used by psychologists and sociologists, but this is not what the AAMC, which are the test makers of the MCAT, this is not what they have in mind when they think of these terms. So a really, really critical thing is not memorizing the terminology that's required for psych soc, but it's memorizing how the AAMC wants you to know that terminology, what the AAMC definition of that terminology is, and then applying that throughout different passages and different tricky situations to make sure that you really understand word for word what the AAMC means when they give you, for example, operant conditioning, which is a very, very high yield psychology topic that deals with how to basically align voluntary behavior into desired action. So the whole psychology and sociology section is really just taking these words and these terminologies and applying them to the passage in the way that the AAMC wants you to do so, not in the way that many field psychologists and sociologists would do. So again, it's a little bit tricky to kind of navigate where psychology and sociology bridges off with its own little AAMC bubble. But that's one thing that we're definitely going to be doing in the course. I'm not sure how many of you have used Antidex, but we'll be reviewing Antidex throughout the course as well. It's a free service that's very, very useful if used properly, but if used improperly, it's a huge waste of time. So again, we're going to be navigating the pros and cons of Antidex throughout the MCAT course here at Kweller as well. So that's a little bit of an overview of the psych soc section, just in terms of how they're going to test you on it. In terms of what they like to test, the psychology section is a little bit of a mix of neurobiology and more modern psychology. So basically, the vast majority of the section is memorizing different psychological theories of development. The main theories that they want you to study are Freud's theories of psychosocial development and Kohlberg's theories of moral psychosocial development. And basically, the high yield topics that we're going to be focusing on for the psych soc section include just different other competing theories of morality and of psychological development. Sociology is a little simpler. So sociology is more of an objective memorization of terminology, which is really important for aspiring doctors to understand social consequences and social stratifications and the impacts that they have on medicine. So this is a little bit of a new topic. So the psych and social section was not on the old MCAT. For those of you that don't know, the MCAT changed format between 2015 and 2016. So there was a period in 2017 and 2018 where a lot of prep companies didn't really know how to study for this exam. So if you guys will see the average and median MCATs of the vast majority of schools in the States have been rising a lot over the past one or two cycles, it's because people have just now in 2019 and 2020 really gained a concrete understanding of how to study for this exam. And that's part of what we're going to be incorporating into the course at Kweller. So kind of dispelling the old notions that are associated with the older versions of the MCAT and even the 2016, 2017 study methodologies, which have been disproven by the much better 2019, 2020 study methodologies that I used for my exam and that we're going to be using throughout the Kweller course. So it's a little bit of a mix of understanding what aspects of the old exam the AAMC has kept, and for the most part, what aspects they changed. So you have three types of material available to you for purchase by the actual AAMC. And in terms of MCAT preparation, these are considered the gold standard of what every single student must purchase. Excuse me. And these are the AAMC question packs, the AAMC section banks, and the AAMC full-length exams. Subsequent material that could help that I purchased that some other students don't, so it's a little bit more optional, are the AAMC flashcards. So just going through each one by one. The question packs are in format based on the old exam. but they're very useful at an early point in your studying to understand what your content is. So the question packs are again based on the old format. So they're not going to help you so much with the strategy of the new format, but they are going to help you with the content. For better or for worse, the content between the two exams is similar. So that's where the question packs come in. Your section banks are your best friends. You have a biology biochemistry section bank, a chemistry physics section bank, and a psychology sociology section bank, each of 100 questions. While your question packs are going to be 120 questions, the section banks are shorter to 100 questions because they contain much longer and more difficult passages. And these section banks are considered the medium to difficult end spectrum of the type of questions that you're going to be getting on your actual MCAT. But outside of your full length AMC exams, these section banks are the premier material in terms of preparation for the MCAT. So you have four full lengths that they introduced, full lengths 1, 2, 3, and 4, but you also have a sample full length. The difference between your four full length exams and your sample full length is that the four full length exams are based on a scaled score, meaning that you get a number between 472 and 528, which is what your actual MCAT score is going to be. But the sample exam, as the AAMC calls it, is free, but you don't get an actual scaled score between 472 and 528. There are approximate converters that we can use, but this still does not reflect the full extent to which the AAMC scales their exams. So ultimately, the sample is still not reliable in terms of percent correct, converting that to a scaled score. So your best friends are your full lengths 1 through 4. So again, that's kind of zooming out a little bit, talking a little bit about the how the exam is graded, what the common types of prep material are. Getting back a little bit to the sections, so we talked about the chem physics section. We talked a little bit about the psych soc section. I shared my ideas on the car section. The bio section, I would say it's my personal favorite. I know that I do have a good amount of bias on this just because I have a biological background, but I think that the biology and especially the biochemistry section, it's essentially just logic, in the sense that they give you some inhibitor or they give you a regulator. You write down the name of that regulator, and using a combination of your outside knowledge and a combination of what they give you in the passage, you're just going to be saying this acronym causes this acronym in the cell to go up or down. And that's really what the vast majority of these incredibly difficult biology and biochemistry passages are going to be. That's what I saw a lot of on my exam. That's how I was able to score in the 96th percentile for my biochem section, is again using, like, treating it like a logic, like a logic paper, and understanding that these acronyms, which could stand for some difficult methylation or something technical like that, can actually just be broken down with simple arrows, circles, and sticks. And we'll go over how to do that when we get to that portion of the course. But just kind of as a basic overview. So in terms of biology, there are three main fields of biology that the MCAT tests: molecular biology, cellular biology, and physiology. The MCAT has some low yield anatomy. So I know a lot of students say, should I take anatomy before the MCAT? I wouldn't recommend it, just because there are many, many more efficient courses such as genetics and immunology that are much more high yield on your MCAT, that a good knowledge of anatomy doesn't really help that much prior to taking your MCAT. That's why med schools focus heavily on anatomy within their curriculum, because they know that it's not tested heavily on the MCAT, and they have chosen it that way for a reason, because anatomy is a little bit more memorization based and the MCAT's a little bit more strategy based. So you have physiology, not so much anatomy, molecular biology. So again, we need to have good working understandings of DNA, RNA, the basic processes in the cell like transcription and translation, how they are regulated by hormones, the signal transduction pathways, whereas cell can communicate information from one to another, the basics, ion channels. So kind of building off of that, a little bit about neurons and neuron action potentials. So that has to do with ion channels as well. That was actually the focus of my master's thesis. So I have a special relationship with that material. Like I said, you have a little bit of cell biology, chemiosmosis, which is the cell's movement in response to a chemical stimulus, is really, really important, not just in this section, but it's really important in the psychology section as well, because a lot of neurotransmitters, they can test you on neurotransmitters in terms of their biochemical effects on both your biochem section, but they can also test you on these psychological disorders that are associated with these neurotransmitters on your psychology, sociology section as well. So the main thing is that you have to understand with the high yield material, like I said before, it's very, very interwoven. So you can get a question about amino acids in your chemistry physics section that, of course, relies on knowledge of biochemistry, but then they can ask you that same knowledge and they can have you apply it in a slightly different way in the biochemistry section, and that makes for a completely different question. So the main fears I would say associated with the MCAT is that it's your first difficult exam. The SAT is of course not easy, but the MCAT is twice in length, and the MCAT requires upper level undergraduate subjects that the SAT doesn't. So it's the first kind of difficult exam that a lot of students take. A lot of students don't understand the right ways to study for these kind of beast exams, as they're called, like the USMLE Step 1, the Step 2, the MCAT. So I would say the MCAT is your first real exam. You know, organic chemistry is not easy, biochem is not easy, but the MCAT is going to be more difficult than your undergraduate level courses, in the sense that it doesn't just require on you memorizing stuff, but it requires on you applying a depth of information across a wide variety of different fields. And knowing exactly what those depths are is, in my opinion, the most difficult part about MCAT studying. It's what me and the team that I've worked with in the past, like I said, that charges 3 times as much as Francis's for this course, for a lot fewer sessions. So obviously, I wouldn't recommend them. We've worked to develop these strategies. These strategies have proven to be successful for our students. You know, I've worked with students that have taken 1 or 2 months to study for their MCATs, and they've gotten 506s and 507s. Now, of course, I'm sure that's not the goal score of anybody here. Just for comparison, 506, 507 is roughly what you would need to get into an osteopathic school of medicine, which is not a bad option for a lot of people. But I'm assuming that a lot of you guys here are going to be aiming at top 40 or top 50 allopathic medical schools across the country. So we're going to be more be looking for the 515 to 520 range. But if we are able to accomplish in 1 month with students that have, add one guy, he took off for 10 years after his undergraduate studies. He studied with me for a month and he broke 502 or 503 on his exam, which is competitive for an osteopathic medical school. So I'm just saying, imagine with you guys, if we have a fully structured course, what we're going to be able to do lesson by lesson in terms of we have, I believe the first session for the course is going to last 3 to 4 months. So in those 3 to 4 months, I'm expecting to at least see for everybody an initial jump of 10 points from your sample exam to your first or second full length exams. Now, for a lot of students, they don't see this jump until about 1 or 2 weeks before their actual exam. And I've seen this a lot. I've seen this personally. This was my story. This was the story of a lot of friends that I had. Just as a comparison, I have one guy, went to St. John's, 4.0 GPA student, years of research, years of clinical experience. He was scoring 503, 504 on his practice exams. I worked with him a little bit. He instituted some of my concepts and strategies. And again, there's no magic wand. You know, he worked his butt off for about a month, and he saw a jump immediately between practice exams from 504 to 516, and then from 516 consistently to 517. And those are all around the 95th percentile mark on the MCAT. So that's really it in terms of what I want to talk about as an overview. I want to open up the floor for questions because I'm sure there are a lot of questions related to the MCAT, definitely. So please, if you guys have any questions, now would be a great time to ask.
Yeah, guys, don't be shy because
Please,
Sam
yeah.
like has a wealth of knowledge. So please don't be shy. You can type into the chat. This isn't a particularly large group, so we can really just enjoy this opportunity to ask any questions that you can. And Sam, can you just tell us what other classes, subjects you teach right now, just so that we get a
Sure.
good picture, what you're teaching at Kweller, what you teach at the college where you work. So just everything so that we get a good picture of who you are while they're thinking of everything. Okay, go
Sure.
ahead.
So at Quiller, I focus right now on AP Bio and AP Physics. Sorry, AP Chemistry. I do have some physics students as well. So the AP exams are designed by the College Board, which recently, for the 2021 version of the exam, they've attempted to model it after the MCAT. So in studying for the AP exams with these students, I've also been able to kind of refine my approach just a little bit the way that the AAMC designs the MCAT. So at Kweller, I'm mostly focused on AP Bio and AP Chemistry. This is the first time that we're doing this kind of course with Kweller, and of course, I'm very, very excited. At St. John's, I am an adjunct professor for biochemistry and molecular biology courses right now. I've taught in the past organismal biology, introductory biology, which is basically like an evolution course, and various sections of molecular biology. So I've seen throughout the many, many pre-med students that I've had as a professor in the labs that I teach, that certain students, when they're studying for their MCATs, don't really have a good grasp. So they think that the little technical details that we go over in lab are going to be useful for them for their MCAT studying. That's not really true. So what I've worked on with them is kind of shortening the framework of what they're studying is focused on, but increasing the depth of what they're learning. And that's really what the MCAT is. The MCAT can technically ask you about a bunch of different topics, but the trick is really understanding what those high yield topics are to get you to those 90th percentiles. Once you're past 90th percentile, then yes, start studying the lower yield material. And then, that will get you to the 95th to 98th or even 100th percentile. But again, to get to that 98th percentile, it's studying a depth of a small amount of material. And that's what I focused on throughout the students that I've helped on a little bit of an unofficial basis, students that I've had in labs at St. John's. So that's a little bit about what I teach at Kweller, and what I teach at St. John's right now. So Fatima is asking, how do you manage both completing content review for the MCAT and practice questions? Every single person that breaks the 520 on the MCAT will tell you that their biggest kind of regret or their biggest weakness in their studying was doing too much content. If you can read an MCAT passage and understand what they're talking about without getting freaked out, you have enough of a content background. So the content is important because you can't just do practice questions. You're not going to learn like that. But the best way to review that content is with constant, realistic practice. And once you get to that practice, you'll be able to see an AAMC question. And you won't necessarily know why a certain question is correct, but you'll know that a question is correct and you'll pick it. So this idea of picking the right answer, we only need maybe 30% content for that skill and 70% question strategy. So content is very useful. It's important to complete your content, of course, but that's like saying that it's important to study for your lecture exam, but not take the actual exam itself, right? Practice questions, it's like you're taking the actual exam itself. You cannot just focus on content. If I had to say which one to focus more on, I would definitely say lean more on practice questions, because by repeating practice questions, you're in a way also studying content. So again, brush through your content, make sure you get a decent understanding, do practice questions, and then after that, you're just going to be watching some niche videos from resources that I would highly, highly recommend on certain little 10 to 15 explanations of niche topics that you're still struggling with. So get a basis, do a lot of practice questions, and then focus on those niche topics that you're struggling with 10 to 15-minute videos. All right, so Bill is asking, what role does the MCAT play in med school admissions? So this is kind of one of those great unknowables in the sense that every single school will give you a different answer for this. So as a kind of general rule of thumb, schools that accept lower MCATs are a little bit more holistic. What that means is that they view your community service records, they view your clinical records, but they don't really care about research that much. So for research-heavy schools, they definitely are going to ask you why you hypothetically did not do well on your MCAT, why you scored below 92nd, 93rd percentile on your MCAT, because the MCAT, the current version of it, is so research-based. So the role that the MCAT plays in med school admissions, they say, again, this is kind of a general rule of thumb. Whether it's super useful, I'm not sure. So there are two components to your admissions. There's your extracurriculars and there's your stats. Your stats are your GPA and your MCAT. Depending on the undergraduate at university that you go to, your MCAT has more or less weight. For example, if you're going to Brandeis or Columbia or NYU, your MCAT does not necessarily have as much weight. So you can maybe get away with the 88th or 89th percentile MCAT. If you're coming from a school like the Queens College Macaulay program or the Hunter Macaulay program or St. John's or Adelphi, you want to focus on that 92nd, 93rd percentile MCAT so that your hypothetical 3.7 GPA competes with a 3.7 GPA of the kids coming from the NYU's, the Stony Brooks, the Columbias. So again, the role that the MCAT plays in med school admissions is a little bit ambiguous. So the weight that the MCAT has kind of differs from school to school. Some schools have cutoffs, so they will not accept you. They will not even interview. They will not review your application if you get below a certain MCAT score. I know Hofstra has a cutoff. I believe New York Medical College has a cutoff. I know that some schools have a little bit of an unofficial cutoff where if you get below like a 515 or 510, 515 is around 90th percentile, 510 is around 80th percentile, they're not going to give you a serious consideration. So has all my effort on the MCAT paid off? I would say definitely it's paid off. Like I said, I have 3 interviews to pretty good programs so far that I'm very happy with. Um, my MCAT efforts have not only helped me, they've helped students that I've worked with in the past as well. When you are studying for your MCAT, it feels like there's no end. You cannot see the end light of the tunnel, especially if you're not doing so well in your practice exams. Eventually, after you've taken your MCAT, after you've gotten your amazing score, you look back on those times pretty fondly, like I do now. Like, man, like that was a fun time. So I really think that all of everyone's efforts with the MCAT eventually does pay off. The MCAT is an investment. So these few hundreds of dollars or tens of hundreds of dollars that you guys are investing right now, if it's even worth an extra 2 or 3 points on your MCAT, and I'm sure that you guys are going to be seeing 5 to 10 point jumps after the course versus before the course. But hypothetically, if it's worth only 2 to 3 points, that those 2 to 3 points can be the difference of you getting accepted to a med school that has a $40,000 a year tuition and a med school that has an $80,000 a year tuition. So over the course of 4 years, that's $250,000. So again, the price of investing in good, solid MCAT material right now, it's a massive investment. I would definitely say that all of the MCAT efforts that I've been putting in and that my students have been putting in definitely pays off, without question. Fatima asked another question: are the MCAT questions based on provided passages or more random and memorization based? So Fatima, there are 3 types of questions on the MCAT. One of them, it's just based on random memorization of anything that the AMC wants to ask you. We call those standalone questions. The other type are passage questions. So passage questions are just, they give you a passage and they'll ask you to interpret some data from that passage alone with no background information required. These are pretty easy. The hardest type of questions are where they try to intertwine the passage, sorry, I was just reading the next question. The most difficult types of questions are where they intertwine background knowledge questions with passage-based questions. Because now not only do you need to have a solid interpretation of the passage, you need to now take that solid interpretation of the passage and match it with background knowledge that you've been studying previously that previous groups have researched decades earlier. So it's a little bit of a mix between provided passage questions or more random and memorization-based questions for Fatima. So Bill has another question. What is the most typical score to have a solid chance to get into any med school? The main score that you want to focus on for any medical school in New York State, it's going to be around 513. That's kind of the safe cutoff to ensure that you're accepted into an allopathic program. Osteopathic programs are a little different. So for an osteopathic program to have a solid shot, you want to aim around a 507 to a 508, which is around 70th percentile, whereas a 513 is around 83rd, 84th percentile. Are there any other questions? Right? Are the MCAT scores percentages or percentiles? They are percentiles. So you can get 5 questions wrong, and based on however many everybody else got wrong, your 5 questions wrong is legally 98th percentile, or it could be legally 75th percentile. So that's why it's really, really important to not just know information that's going to be on the exam, but to know the information that everybody else is going to know. And this is where your high yield topics come in. Because if you get the information that everybody else is supposed to know wrong, that's really going to mess up your curve. So first you need to know the easy memorization, then the medium difficulty memorization, then the more difficult, nuanced, might get you a point or 2 levels of memorization come at the end. So it's percentiles based. So you don't need to do well, you just need to do better than everybody else in terms of actual amount of correct answers on the MCAT. All right. Sorry, confusing about what percent it needs. So again, the percentage of questions that you need, Bella, it's completely determinant on how everybody else did on those same questions that you got. And this process is very ambiguous how the AAMC determines this. There are no formulas that are really known, that are really valid. You know, different people have theories, but nothing really holds up compared to the AAMC standards. So, to an extent, we don't really know how your particular exam is going to be scored, but we do know that your exam is scored on a percentile scale basis relative to how everybody else did on those same questions. So, again, like I said before, 5 questions wrong could be 98th percentile, it could be 70th percentile, depending on how everybody else does on that same set of questions. And these percentiles change from year to year. So, Bill, most people that apply to medical school unfortunately do not get in. There's a roughly 40% med school acceptance rate. I can tell you that those people, not to be rough, but they weren't tutored by me. And the kind of the median MCAT that students apply with is a 506. The median MCAT that students get accepted with around now, it's a 511 to 512. So the students that are getting rejected are the students with the lower MCATs, basically, right? So the MCAT, again, like I said, it's critical. It's probably going to be the most important factor. There are many other factors that different med schools anticipate in reviewing your application. I mentioned them. Before. So just going back to the questions here, what alternative paths to medical school? If you take your MCAT, all right, so I'm kind of going to mix this with the answer to Pale's question about allopathic and osteopathic schools. There are 3 types of medical schools: podiatry schools, osteopathic schools, and allopathic schools. Podiatry schools, so for those of you that don't know, podiatrists only work with feet. So you're not trained, so you're not going to be working with the entire body. You're just going to be seeing primarily patients about foot problems. So podiatry schools are considered the least competitive, and this is a pretty valid alternative to people that don't do so hot on their MCATs. So podiatry schools take maybe like a 501, 500 MCAT. That's around 50th percentile, which doesn't sound that great. But at the same time, 50th percentile, you're doing 50% better than some of the top undergraduate pre-meds in the country. So 50% on an exam would be horrible. 50 percentile on an MCAT is not as kind of objectively bad. So the approximate scoring breakdown, so a 500 is 50th percentile. 500 is always defined as 50th percentile. 506, Fatima, 506 is approximately a little bit below 70th percentile, maybe 65th percentile. That's the range that is a strong percentile for DO schools. Again, I know that 65th to 70th percentile sounds pretty easy to get, but most students score well below that on their first try because, again, there's a lot of material that you need to know, and the AAMC tests you on it in a pretty difficult way. Just kind of going back to the question, so I think that I missed a couple. Bella, a certain score does not always correlate to a certain percentile. The AAMC changes it every year. The only thing that we know for sure about the scoring is that you are scored relative to how well everybody else does. Approximately from year to year, the percentiles stay roughly the same. So a few years ago, a 511 was like 85th percentile. This year, a 511, I believe, is 79th percentile. I just go to show you that they're changing it and that they're making it more difficult every single year. Next year, it's probably going to be even more difficult because during this past cycle, a lot of students pushed a year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's just going to be such a massive influx of applicants to the next cycle. So having a higher MCAT is going to be specifically for this next cycle outside of the normal linear trend that we're seeing of increasing MCAT scores. In particular, for this cycle, having a higher MCAT is going to be really critical. So Fatima, you're right. They don't always correlate. The percentiles I went over a bit. So osteopathic and allopathic medical schools. So I mentioned before, podiatry medical schools focus on feet. Osteopathic medical schools focus on what's known as like a holistic whole body approach. They're also a little bit less competitive, but it's also really difficult to get a good residency position, or I should say a great residency position from DO schools. Right now, a lot of residencies are accepting either MD applicants for spots or DO applicants for certain spots. And those MD applicants do get preference. So again, the goal of this program is going to be to get you guys at least 512s and 513s, so that you're really, really competitive for MD programs in the tri-state area. 40% MCAT, 40% GPA, 20% research/hospital internships. Bill, I would say that each and every single one of those schools probably has a different weighting. If you have a 2.9 GPA, but you score 98th percentile on your MCAT, schools are going to want you, right? If you have a 3.7 GPA and you get a 499 on your MCAT, schools aren't going to want you, right? So it's not just GPA and MCAT. It's more about, do you have extremes? Do you have any red flags on your application? If you have a 520 MCAT, 4.0 GPA, but you haven't spent a single minute inside a hospital, chances are you're not getting into a medical school, right? So the med schools want to know, why do you want to become a doctor? You do a good job of answering that question by showing that you can study for your classes, because you're going to have to study for classes in medical school. You do a good job of that question, of answering that question when you get a good MCAT score. This shows them that you know how to take exams, because they don't want you going into their medical schools and then failing the USMLE step 1 and step 2. That looks bad for them. A lot of these medical schools get funding based on their pass rates for these exams. So the MCAT is also to them like, oh, like, how well is this kid going to do on the step 1 and step 2 exams? So you also have to factor that in as well. So again, it's a little bit about minimizing the amount of red and yellow flags that you have on your application. Getting a 510 MCAT below a 510 for most schools is a red flag. For most objective MD programs, for DO schools, is a little bit different. Even if you have a really, really solid 3.9, 4.0 GPA, a 509, 510 MCAT, I've seen this personally with really, really strong applicants that don't have such great MCATs. They don't get into a single medical school. So again, it's a little bit of a mix of a balance more than it is, this percent MCAT, this percent GPA, which makes it difficult for us to interpret. But that's the situation that the AAMC has given to us. So there is a Common App equivalent for all medical schools. You do not apply individually. You find the application on the AAMC website. The application is called AMCAS, and you're going to need to fill that out. It's a lot more difficult than the Common App, I would say. I went through the undergrad admissions process, kind of the supplements, as they call them, for the undergraduate colleges. Med schools have secondaries, except now instead of 1 or 2 paragraphs, you're going to have 1 or 2 pages. So I personally had to write about 150 pages worth of secondary essays for each of the in total the medical schools that I applied to. So the actual writing, the actual application is a lot more difficult than it is for the undergraduate admissions process. So I would say that the actual MCAT studying can't happen at the same time when you're writing your application, because both of these things are such huge factors to medical schools that you really need to spend 24/7 all of your focus on either studying for your MCAT or either writing a really, really solid essays for your application. All right. For teamwork, did the MCAT happen this year? It did. The AAMC filled a lot of socially distant exams this past August for the students that were not able to take it due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Books and materials, we're still determining the best route that we're going to be taking. We're most likely not going to be using Kaplan or Princeton review courses, just because they kind of cover content a lot. And if we do decide to use those books, we're definitely not going to be going through the material with the same depth that they do, because most of the depth that they go through the material with is pretty useless, to be honest. We also may be designing our own Kweller Prep series based on all these different strategies that I've been talking about. And that's going to be a huge advantage to the students that are taking this course as well. Bella, I know severe, but how many months preparation recommended for the test as soon as clean? So if you completed all your pre-med courses, I wouldn't say it's months more than it is hours. So if you have the next 6 months relatively free, then you're good to study for the MCAT over the course of the next 6 months. The main thing about your MCAT studying is you need 1 month of full-time studying before your date. That's really it. 1 month of full-time studying before your date is what you need to synthesize all of your content information. Before that, everyone has their own kind of varying strategies and plans of content, of like a lower level practice questions. That normally takes between 6 to 7 months. For some students, it takes a year. It is possible to do a condensed version of that. But I would say 6 months is the golden rule for that. And then plus and minus of that is dependent on the course, dependent on the student, but approximately 6 months. But critically, with that last month or with the last 5 weeks before your exam being the kind of crunch time for you to get that 5 to 10 score jump that a lot of people do during that time. Um, Bill, do most students go? No, the vast majority. Bill, the vast majority of students take gap years, so they take one post undergraduate year to do research or to focus on clinical work, and that's very, very highly recommended. If a student is not planning to do a gap year, which is possible, I've seen it done. I know how to do it. That student would. I personally am applying. I finished undergrad a little bit early, so technically I'm taking gap years, but I finished undergrad 2 years early. I'm taking two gap years, so time-wise, I'm applying 3 years after high school. So I'm applying with the same amount of time as people who didn't take gap years. So I understand what it's like to have to rush in all of your research and clinical exposures within that set small period of time. Um, so it is possible, but you will need a much higher MCAT if you don't want to take a gap year. That's just a base rule of thumb because you need to show medical scores that you can handle difficult material. Um, Bella, you are definitely welcome. Are there any other questions? We have about 10 minutes left in the session. Anything else we haven't gone over yet? So again, any questions that come to mind, guys, feel free. No question is a bad question, especially with this session. All right. I'm just trying to think if there are some more general. There are some websites that I've personally utilized a lot that I feel are extremely undervalued for your MCAT settings. So we'll be going through how to use these websites properly as well. There are some. Where do we find a database of practice questions? Do we need to buy it from MCAT? So yes, you're definitely going to be buying a lot of material from MCAT. So get your credit cards ready. They have a bundle that goes for around $300, and that is the kind of the recommended bundle to get. That's what the course is mainly going to be focusing on. The material, the books that we're going to be using also likely have practice questions at the end, with practice passages here and there. So the database of practice questions, definitely get the AAMC database. A lot of groups are recommending now the UWorld database. UWorld database is pretty expensive. It's pretty expensive. You kind of rent their database for about 6 months to a year. We may incorporate that into our course. Most likely now, we're still kind of figuring out the do's and don'ts of how we're going to run the course, but it's most likely going to be focused on the AAMC material. All right. The major classes in college that you should take before taking the MCAT: General Chemistry 1, General Chemistry 2, Orgo 1, Orgo 2, Biochem, Molecular Biology, Cell Biology, Physiology, Immunology. I don't know if I mentioned genetics. Biostat, you could definitely get away with not taking biostat. Psychology, sociology could help. Definitely could help. That's really physics 1 and physics 2, definitely. College-based physics is where you want to be. That's algebra-based, calculus-based physics is an absolute waste of time. It's a very, very old prerequisite. Your advisors may be saying, "Oh, take calc-based physics." Med schools like to say that. They won't, unless you got a bad grade in Calc 1, and you want to kind of counter that with a strong grade in physics-based calculus, which I see a lot of students do. Then maybe that's a good pathway for you, and we can talk about that. So we're not just going to be running an MCAT course. It's going to be a little bit of an advisory program as well, based on, like I said, students that I've helped and my own personal experience with the application process as well. Fatima, is it necessary to have finished Physics 2 before studying for the MCAT? Physics 2 has a lot of material that's important for your MCAT, but MCAT Physics is really having a good grasp of a certain key amount of formulas. So we're going to be going over those formulas. We'll be going over the basics of Physics 2. So I would say that it is not necessary to have finished Physics 2 before studying for the MCAT. Definitely before studying for the MCAT, it's not necessary. If you mean before taking the MCAT, I would say it's still not necessary, but might be useful. One thing that I've noticed that helps a lot of students, it helped me personally. Let's say that I'm taking Physics 2, Orgo 2 in the spring. Right now, where we have a little bit of time, and I want to take my MCAT over the summer, right? Bill, I'll get to your question in just a minute. So if I start studying my Orgo and physics right now, I'm both studying for my MCAT and studying for my future courses. So you're helping your GPA and you're helping your MCAT content background. So by the time that you're getting to finals week for those courses and your MCAT is maybe a few weeks or a month away, you don't need to study as much for those courses because you've already been incorporating the key material into your MCAT studies. So I would actually recommend studying for the MCAT before you take Orgo 2 and Physics 2, just because at that point you have a good amount of a branch of Orgo 1 and Physics 1 to comprehend Orgo 2 and Physics 2 topics, and that will help you when you're studying for Orgo 2 and Physics 2 throughout the next semester after you and I have already gone over a little bit about what you need to know for those respective subjects for your exam. All right. So it's taking an MCAT prerequisite at the same time as studying for the exam considered a hindrance. Again, it depends on how you look at it. I personally think that it is a advantage and not a hindrance because you're knocking out two birds with one stone. It can be a hindrance if you don't do it properly, but we'll also be showing, because we're going to be doing this course throughout the spring semester, so a lot of our students are going to be taking coursework at the same time that's related to the MCAT. So we're going to be going over, kind of how you have to separate in your mind what's for your MCAT and what's for your courses, because not everything for your courses is going to be on your MCAT, and not all of your MCAT strategy is going to be useful for your courses, even though the vast majority of it will. So that's another thing that we'll be going through, is kind of navigating how to be very, very efficient in your studying so that you're doing not just MCAT material, but course material as well, right? It isn't necessary for us to finish two. Orgo the hardest requirement for MCAT? Yeah, definitely. Orgo is definitely the hardest required MCAT prep course, because I would say once you have a good grasp of Orgo, your biochemistry is going to be a little bit easier. MCAT biochem is a little bit philosophical. So you need to have a little bit of a wider view of things from a biochemical point of view, incorporating to an extent physiology and hormonal regulation. That's MCAT biochem. So I would say this program and organic chemistry in general, the Orgo is the trickiest part of the MCAT because you also need to weed out what's useless. There's a lot of useless organic chemistry that's not helpful for your MCAT. Memorizing a certain base amount of organic chemistry will help us for the MCAT. All right. Will this program be like us doing practice questions together or submitting work? So we will be going through some practice questions together, of course, and our practice is a very, very important part of anyone's MCAT studying. You will be submitting work to me. I will be grading assignments. The question packs that we're going to be using from the AAMC does have, in and of itself, answers to those questions, but those answers are horrible. So we're going to be going through those questions together with material that I pulled across a lot of different public domain websites as well that I found through my hours and hours and hours of studying how to study for the MCAT. All right. So yeah, you're definitely going to have to do practice questions. You're definitely going to be submitting work to me. I'll stop in the middle of our content review and ask you questions that I know is in like the mind frame of how the AAMC likes to think. So yeah, definitely a lot of that. All right. Okay. All right. Any other questions, guys?
Everyone, let's give Sam a huge thank you. And just thank you so much. You're welcome to go off mute if you want to do that. I don't know. Do I even have that option? Let me see. Meeting settings. I don't know. Can I unmute them? I guess. But you're welcome to go off mute and say thank you. And I just want to remind all of you that I really, really would love for you to join the class, since, as many of you know, the mayor's trying to put me out of business by canceling the SHSAT. So it really means a lot for me if you guys can join the Kweller MCAT class. Please tell your friends that we're running the program. We're running MCAT, LSAT, CPA. We're going to run real estate licensing. We're going to run a juggling class. You know that, Sam? We're going to run a juggling class soon. Okay. So, all right. So just keep that in mind. All right. So please feel free to share that we're running the classes. Don't forget that we have a lot of cool programs coming up, more than one. The MCAT one, I think right now the MCAT should run online. The COVID cases, they're just going up and up and up, and it's like crazy. It's going up in the thousands. So I think that the smartest move is to run this fully online. And, let's see where we are in a few months. But right now, yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Oh, thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate all of you and your thank you. You know what the best thank you would be is a recommendation. I want to remind you, Miss Queller is being put out of business with this mayor. So don't forget. Okay, thank you so much. I'm really looking forward that we have these programs at Queller. So, Sam, there's a question from one of the parents. What would you recommend for middle schoolers if they want to check out programs? But the pathway to high school course is going to be great. So Sam, can you make any quick suggestions for us what they can look into if they're middle school, high school, going into that level?
Sure. First off, the old adage pays off. It's never too early to be a gunner. A lot of the medical schools that I've been applying to, a lot of them in New York have actually asked for your SAT score, because they want to see, who is just getting into academics now versus who's been academics their entire life. And obviously, the people that have been in academics their entire life get a little bit of a priority. So in terms of a high school focus, I would definitely say that focusing on the SAT is really important. Clinical exposure, I would say in high school, is not ultra useful, just because the vast majority of medical schools actually do not want to see that on your application, in the sense that they will not count that as clinical exposure. That would be a little bit of time wasted. Research exposure, I would say, is invaluable during high school, because a poster presentation or a published paper in high school you can put on your AAMC application to medical school, whereas just clinical exposure in high school, they really don't want to see that on the applications. So at the middle school level, clinical research might be a little bit too early. So I would say at the middle school level, the best thing would be focusing on a high school that has pathways to a lot of these different clinical research programs. Basic science research is a little bit different from clinical research. That's kind of very, very tricky for high school students to get into, but clinical research they can definitely get into. They can easily produce some papers. I've seen similar opportunities through some different internship programs that I can talk about a little bit throughout the course as well, for students that are interested in these clinical research opportunities. Right. Okay. That's it in terms of the advice that I have for high school students. So start a clinical research position early and try to get as many poster presentations and publications as you can in high school. Very, very helpful.
And I want to just thank all of you for supporting the programs. Did I remind you that the mayor's trying to put me out of business? So please remember to support every single program that we have. The word of mouth is really important because we're not in person lately. And well, how else can I say this? The mayor is trying to put me out of business. So we really, really need your support, guys. Okay. I'll speak to you soon. Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye. Bye, Sam. You're the best. Okay. Bye.
Pleasure, everybody. See you guys.